On June 27, 1938, a Russian by the name of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was arrested for attempted sabotage of Russia's Scientific Research Institute No. 3. Korolev spent the next 7 years in the Gulag labor camps. In 1945, he was named Lieutenant Colonel of the Red Army and was sent to Berlin, where he spied on the latest creation in technological warfare, the V-2 missile. Korolev developed a list of potential improvements for the V-2 in order to make it lighter and faster. Before long, he designed plans for a rocket that could travel 400 miles farther than the V-2. On August 21, 1957, after 5 failed launches, Korolev's plans launched into the sky in the form of the R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. It was 108 feet tall with 4 62-feet strap-ons surrounding its core. Meanwhile, similar tests by Americans continued to fail. The Soviets wasted little time, and on October 4, 1957, launched a 184-pound silver ball, 23 inches in diameter with 4 radio antennae, 150 miles from the Earth's surface. Sputnik 1 emitted an audible signal for 22 days and traveled around Earth for 3 months at a speed of 18,000 miles per hour. The Russians had not only successfully launched Sputnik 1, but also a space race between the U.S. and the USSR that would last until the late 20th century. But what if Korolev had stuck with the V-2? What if he had never designed the R-7? What if Sputnik had failed to launch? The launch of Sputnik was a publicity goldmine for Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader from Texas. With goals of being a future contender for the presidency, Johnson made national security his area of expertise. President Eisenhower's response to Sputnik was lacking, but the publicity Johnson brought to Sputnik's implications set the public into a panic and arranged Johnson to look like the man with all the answers. Therefore, because of Sputnik, LBJ was chosen as John F. Kennedy's running mate in the presidential election of 1960. Had Sputnik failed to launch, Kennedy would have chosen Adlai Stevenson, who had experience with campaigning as the Democrats' presidential candidate in 1952 and 1956. LBJ had appealed to Kennedy as a running mate because of where he was from, Texas. Without LBJ as a running mate, Kennedy would have failed to capture the South's electoral votes and therefore lost to Richard Nixon in the election of 1960, never getting the chance to challenge Americans to land a man on the moon. When Nixon actually served as president from 1969 to 1974, he implemented the policy of Vietnamization, which gradually limited American involvement with the Vietnam War. Hence, had Nixon been president in 1960, he would not have gotten involved with Vietnam at all, and would have instead issued a proclamation of neutrality. Fast forward 40 years to 2001, when President George W. Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act, which rewarded states whose schools developed assessments for math and reading with federal funding. Had Sputnik not launched, the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which gave more than $1 billion to public schools' science programs, never would have been created, causing science to be a weakness in American schools. Without Sputnik and the National Defense Education Act, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 would have failed due to its emphasis on math and reading and negligence of science. The National Defense Education Act also established direct loans of federal money to college students. Had it not been created, the Student Aid and Fiscal Responsibility Act, or SAFRA, of 2010 would have passed, setting the precedent for direct loans of federal money to college students, and abolishing the Federal Family Education Loan Program, which lent federal money to private agencies, which in turn aided students. Had Sputnik failed to launch and the National Defense Education Act not been created, the switch from guaranteed lending of the Federal Family Education Loan Program to the direct lending of SAFRA would have saved the government $87 billion over 10 years. Had the No Child Left Behind Act failed to pass, Obama's Race to the Top program, which gives $1.35 billion to improve instruction in every subject, would have set a precedent for federal funds going towards science in public schools. 2 years after No Child Left Behind in 2003, the United States was in the midst of invading Iraq. This military campaign was the first to be run entirely by satellite and lasted only a month and a half. But had Sputnik failed to launch, the United States or any other country would have assumed that if the Soviets couldn't launch a satellite, then the task was impossible. Another attempt never would have been made, and therefore GPS, which is entirely dependent on satellites, would not exist today. Therefore, the invasion of Iraq would have been executed in a different way and would have taken much longer than it did. So what would have happened if Korolev had stuck with the V-2 and failed to launch Sputnik? There would be some benefits. The space race and the buildup of nuclear arms that accompanied it would never have occurred, and the U.S. wouldn't have gotten involved with Vietnam. Ultimately, however, it would not have been a victory for the United States, but a loss. Without Sputnik, Americans never would have landed a man on the moon. There would be no GPS, no cell phones, no internet. The question for Americans would still be why, not why not. There would be no precedent of Americans achieving what had previously been thought of as impossible. The American mentality of reaching for the stars would not be in existence. The U.S. would be a country that settled for what it understood, rather than one with an affinity for pushing boundaries.